Now on your switch, if you want to configure the AAA authentication, first you need an authentication server. It could be a Radius server. It could be a TACAC server. Cisco has a server called the Secure ACS that's capable of doing both. And on that server, it can have its own internal database of users. It could connect to an Active Directory realm or domain to use their user accounts for authentication. There's some options here. But anyway, on the switch, what you would do in global config is type in the first one to turn on AAA, which is a command called AAA new model. All right, I like to joke about that. I've been typing AAA new model for 8, 9, 10 years. I'm wondering when it's the old model. Anyway, okay, you might not find that funny, I realize. The next part is configure the Radius server. Where's the Radius server going to be? What's its IP address? What port's it using? And most Radius servers require a secret key to be able to authenticate or make the connection. So the command in global config would be Radius server, host followed by the host IP address, auth port, AUTH-port for the port used on the destination, and then the keyword key followed by whatever the actual secret key is going to be. Type that in clear text. From there, you can choose the type of login. Now, this is not going to take you through all of the different types of authentication options that are available to you. But when you use the command AAA authentication login, you can make a default list. And the default list can say, here's the list of objects that you're going to use for authentication. And so when I create this default list, I could say, let's look at Radius. If you can't get in through Radius, try local. If local doesn't work, then we can even try line. Now, I know that sounds odd when you think about this, but here's what we're saying. We're saying we're going to force you to log in, username and password. We're going to send those credentials to the Radius server first. Now, if the Radius server rejects you because it's the wrong username and password, you're done. You're not getting in. But if we have a connectivity problem with the Radius server, for whatever reason I can't get through the network to get to the Radius server and it times out, then I'll check the local database. Now, local means that you would have configured a local user and password on the device itself. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, it either is missing or doesn't exist, I can go to your line configuration. If you put a password on your console line, if you put a password on your telnet lines, I can then ask you for that line password. Notice not username and password, but password. The goal is to get you in. Now, if you leave off local and line and those types of things and just say Radius, most of the time you're good to go. But if you're wanting to troubleshoot connectivity and the specific problem is you can't connect to the Radius server's network anymore, then guess what? If that's your only choice for logging in, you're not logging in. You're stuck. You're going to have to go through a password recovery just to get into the box because if you don't put local, it'll stop with the last authentication server you used, Radius, and if it's not able to be connected, you're done. It doesn't default and give you an extra try. Okay. Now, the other part of that is I can use a command with the login that says, hey, if there's no authentication, then there's nothing you're going to get it done. So what else? Oh, the line, the consoles, the telnet lines or the VTY lines, telnet SSH. You can go to configure those lines because one of the things we said was that you would use the line password. So you type line VTY 0 / 15 so you can configure 16 lines. Choose the login authentication default. What's the default? Well, default's that default group I just created, right? Radius, local, and line. And then I could say, here's your line password. Password San Fran. So you have to type in San Fran. And then I could go to the line console 0 and say, hey, look, for this one, there's no authentication. However you want to set it up, that's really cool. You've got a lot of flexibility. And of course, don't forget in the global config, since you also said local, you need to use the username, password combination to create a valid username and a valid password that can be used as local authentication. We're going to set up some authentication requirements on switch number 4 to see if it works when I either connect in through the console port or if I connect in through switch number 3. Now on switch number 3, I'm going to attempt to telnet. In fact, we'll get into the privilege exec mode. And I will telnet to 10.0.0.40, which should be the address of switch number 4. And I have a set up anyway, a telnet password, a VTY password of Cisco. And there I see that I got in just fine, so I'll exit out of there. and I'm back into switch 3. Okay, so we're going to make some changes here and see what some of the options are beyond just a simple password. So on switch number 4, we're going to start off by creating a username, and my username will be Ken with a password of Cisco. Now this is done for local authentication. That means that in just this particular switch, the combination of the name Ken and Cisco automatically counts as a valid username. It's not something that's stored in my Radius server. Now that I have that, we're going to turn on the AAA new model. That's our way of being able to begin to set up some authentication options. Now from here, we're going to define a Radius server that doesn't actually exist. That's okay, because if we set this up correctly, in fact, we'll put it on the same subnet, 00, we'll make it 100. The way we set that up is that if the Radius server does not respond, that it will still ask for the local authentication. So we're going to try to set that up. Now, there are some other options here. There's your question mark. If we have a different authentication port, we can set that up. The default's 1812. And most Radius servers need some sort of pre-shared key. So I'll make the key San Jose. All right, I've defined a Radius server, but like I said, it doesn't exist, so it will not respond, which is an important part of what we're going to do here on the next step. So we're going to say for our next option, we're going to do AAA Authentication, and I'll hit the tab key here to set some of this up. So AAA, and the next one, Authentication. I needed an E to autocomplete that. The authentication, this is for logging in, and after the login, I'll just show you the question mark options. We're going to use the default authentication list. So now I've typed in default, and the next one is going to ask for a type of authentication. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use a default server group that we're going to create, and the first one is Radius. Now of course it's going to use the Radius server that we've just set up. When I do the question mark again, I have some options. If Radius doesn't exist, or doesn't respond I should say, then I can use local. Now I'm going to suggest that you always use local on your list so that you don't lock yourself out of this device should you be troubleshooting a connection and you can't get to the Radius server. That's a kind of a bad catch-22. Now if there's no local account or username, I hit the question mark. I can also set it up to do something like the line password for authentication. In this case, on my VTY lines, I have that password option set up. All right, so just like that, I've done the login information to be able to basically go through Radius to local database where I do have a user account, or the line password. Now the next part of this, another option you have with the AAA authentication that you saw here, let me hit the question mark, is is to create your own group here, and we'll see if we can do that here without any anything bad coming in here. But we're going to do authentication login, and we're using a word. Now the word means that I'm coming up with my own name of a group or authentication list. I'm going to call it no auth, and here I have an option for this particular group to use none, to not use any authentication. All right, so I have two groups really. I have the default group and this one that I just created called no auth. Now, from that point, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the VTY lines, all 16 of them, line VTY 0 through 15, and we're going to say let's log in as a command, and for the authentication, now here's the question mark, I can use the one I just created, no auth, or I can use default. So I'm going to use default on our setup here. And I'm going to make sure we have that line password. Remember, if I put in my default group to use the line password to get in there, which I already had it set up as Cisco, but just so you can see me put it in there, I'll put in that line setup. And I am not configuring, if you notice, I'm not going to configure the authentication for the console port. All right, so I'm going to exit all the way out of this switch, coming back into the console port, and it's asking for my username and password. So I just typed in my username Ken, my password Cisco. I'm not seeing anything at the moment, and you're wondering, well, did it break? And the answer is no, it didn't really break. What it's doing is it's waiting for the Radius server to basically time out and not respond, and then it will let me in. So we'll just give it a second to do its job. Meanwhile, back at switch number 3, if I try that same telnet to the 1040, it's doing the same thing. I put in my name, username Ken, Cisco. And okay, so over here I typed Cisco twice and hit enter, which is why you saw that extra pop-up. But I am logged in. It took a little bit of time because, like I said, it was looking for that or waiting for the timeout of the Radius server. So I can type in enable. I still have the enable secret, which is also Cisco, and I'm back into switch number 4. So on this screen, I'm using the console port. On the remote one from switch 3, I'm using the telnet. Well, let's change the console port then on switch number 4. Let's get back into configuration mode. Line console 0. And here we're going to type in login authentication no-auth. And that was our command that said there is no need for logging in through the console port. And so I'm going to exit all the way back out, exit one more time. I'm all the way out. I hit return to get started, and I'm in now without having to authenticate, because on the console port, by assigning that group I created, I basically said don't require a password. That was my own pre-made group. All right, so there's my options for setting up some of the authentication. It's certainly better than just having an enable secret or a console password, especially with the use of Radius. It allows me to use my Active Directory or domain level account at virtually every router or switch that I want to get logged into and configure.